Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, December 12th, and let's start with Venezuela. So, there was an oil tanker that we just seized off of Venezuela. Why'd we do that? Is this a big deal? What does this mean?
Um, well, I didn't seize it. Of course, we're talking about the U.S. I'm sorry, that was a bad joke. But
Yeah,
anyway,
that was horrible, but continue.
okay. Um, yeah. Why did we do it? It's not entirely clear, but it's probably just part of this pressure campaign, I would say, uh, directed against Maduro and his government. It could be the beginning of some sort of economic blockade. I don't know if they're going to go that far, because they could starve the country. Um, they've already immiserated it in so many ways as a result of the economic sanctions that have been placed on it over the years. But an outright sea blockade would be really devastating, of course, to the Venezuelan economy. It remains to be seen if that's the plan. Nothing has been announced. I think there was some claim that the oil was going to Cuba and then the tanker was destined to Iran. It's not clear to me if any of that is true or if that's the reason, or because they make up things, as some people have pointed out already. This is we thought they had their story straight. It used to be that, this is all about the drugs and the narco terrorists, and now it's about the oil. Um, I saw a very confused response. There was some reporter who said that, hey, you've been telling us that this is all about narco terrorism, and now you're seizing an oil tanker. What's going on? And is it now also about oil? And Trump gave a very confused reply. I mean, he went on and on about how bad the Venezuelans are, and how they were sending murderers. I think 11,888 murderers to the U.S. I don't know if that figure was entirely invented or is based on something. And in other words, he really didn't answer the question. So we don't know. We don't know what's going on. This whole this effort seems to be very confused. I think it's fair to say. I don't think it was ever thought out clearly, and they're making things up as they go along. He did, I think, in that very same answer in the press conference, he did say, we're doing things in the air and on the sea, and we're now going to start doing things on the ground. So that's an indication, again, that there may be, strikes or even perhaps, landings of Marines, who knows? But it seems to me that he said similar things even, maybe a couple of weeks ago, and nothing happened. Well, who knows? It
Yeah,
just gets
it's weird.
murkier and murkier as it goes on.
Yeah, it feels like we have one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake when it comes to Venezuela. We're just kind of spinning our tires, and the engine's going to blow at some point. I don't know what's going to
Yeah,
happen, but
yeah.
this seizing this oil, is this going to have repercussions? I mean, clearly this is obviously illegal. I mean, the U.S. will make just some pretense for the United States so we can do it. We just say
Right.
terrorism whenever we want to do something illegal.
Yeah, yeah. No, it clearly is. It's, I think, a clear violation of the anti-piracy laws. It's piracy. It's theft on the high seas. That's what it is. But I don't think the U.S. will suffer any consequences for it, other than further reputational damage. I mean, it is a bad look. There is, of course, the U.S. still has its Amen chorus, its cheering squad, and they're not going to be disturbed by it, both within the U.S. and outside. The Machados of the world, they do exist even in places like Venezuela. But the rest of the world, looks at this and they see, further evidence of, of a rather, of a hegemon, of a country that just won't accept any kinds of constraints on its behavior. It acts as it wants to act, and it violates the law when it wants to violate the law. This is what's happened. Now, I don't know. similar things have been attempted against Iran, and Iran has retaliated again and again. It's happened actually several times over the last several years. So we will seize a tanker, or usually it's a proxy seizes a tanker. Like, for example, we ask Greece to, and then immediately the Iranians will seize a couple of Greek tankers. And this is something that's happened again. The Iranians, I guess, understand that there's really no law that they can, there are no courts that they can resort to achieve justice. And so the only answer is tit for tat. I don't know how Venezuela is going to do that. Maybe one of their allies will help them out. We'll see. There is a possibility of some kind of retaliation.
So there's no course of action. I mean, there are these international bodies. We know that they are run by the collective West for the most part. But if you bring a very open and shut case of piracy to these courts and the courts just strike it down, then doesn't that destroy the court? And in that sense, that's a victory for the collective South to end the U.S. hegemonic order. So shouldn't you still be some type of course of action? Even though it sounds mundane and
I understand. It's sort of like what's done in the UN, the International Court of Justice and its rulings. Of course, those rulings are ignored by Israel and the U.S., but it does strengthen the case of the victim, and it does further damage the reputations of the perpetrators. So it's something. I don't really know exactly what courts are you would resort to. If there are special international maritime courts, I'll admit ignorance on that score.
Yeah, international courts and these institutions are strange because just how do you enforce them? It's like, oh, I'm going to sue this country, and the country's like, all right, well, I'm here, come and get it. Like that's the problem why these don't really work, right?
Right.
Is that the fundamental issue?
Again, it can work for against weaker countries. Because the larger countries more powerful countries, let's say just the collective West, can gang up and enforce it, through collective action. And that we've seen that happen. It just, for example, the ICC has convicted various leaders of small, weak countries of war crimes, and then some of them get grabbed, right? But it just never happens. The ICC doesn't even dare to bring a case, or it didn't dare to bring a case against George W. Bush, because that would be the end of the ICC. So it really is, there is this international court system, but there's the law of the jungle, and the law of the jungle seems to prevail.
So really, that's how we should look at it then. Might makes right in when it comes to these international institutions.
Yeah, right. I think, unfortunately, it's really always been true and always will be true. I think it was less true during the first Cold War because there was something of a balance of power. And because of that, there was an incentive on both sides, maybe not to cheat, because there was, you couldn't act with reckless abandon the way that the U.S. does now. Again, that's really a product of the hype of the unipolar moment of once being the hyperpower and not very willingly abandoning that position.
Right. But the U.S. isn't in that unipolar moment anymore. So, I mean, it's still acting like it is, but now it's finding that there are repercussions for its actions, right? So I'm just wondering if there will be something here, or it's just kind of that etching away at its soft power, and that is just lending more and more, destroying the legitimacy of the U.S. hegemon.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if there are going to be any really significant repercussions for this, unfortunately. I mean, it really is a case of piracy. And again, I find it shameful. As an American citizen, I'm bothered by this, that our government does things like this. Very bothered by it. But I don't think there will be any repercussions. One thing that actually this action just reminded me, let's say a certain inconsistency in the recent strategy paper that came out and that we discussed a few days ago. There was there was a lot of talk about respect for sovereignty, and almost an acknowledgement, to some extent, an acknowledgement of the multipolar world, the reality of this new multipolar world. But uh, yet you could see, that there was the U.S. in spite of that, you have to admit there's maybe signs of a growing realism and a signs of an awareness of some of the limits on its power. It wasn't really abandoning its preeminent position. And we could see that I think, if we contrast East Asia to Latin America. In Latin America, we had the Trump corollary, which seems to mean that it's a kind of Monroe Doctrine on steroids. It's the Monroe Doctrine actually was fairly limited in what it sought to achieve, and that was just to keep foreign powers out of the region. Now, with the Trump corollary, it really extends to all kinds of what we would normally consider to be, entirely internal policy decisions, and contracts with companies from different countries, for example, economic relations, things that should be decided by the market and don't really, at least according to the old understanding, didn't affect national security. But this made clear that, hey, no, we're going to be your number one trade partner, in not so many words. That's what this new strategy document said. And if we're not, we have means. There was a threat.
What means though? Like, what's the power of enforcement?
Yeah. Well, it said various, the various methods or various means, and didn't name them, but I think we can see, what goes on. If, we can use economic sanctions, but we can also use raw military power, and that's what's happening in Venezuela. Well, so anyway, Venezuela has this relationship with countries that are adversaries of the U.S. And so the U.S., I think that's really the main motivation. If you want to understand what they're trying to do in Venezuela, what has led to this, that's what's put a target on them. Now, so anyway, yeah, they do this. So essentially, the U.S. has declared the Western Hemisphere to be its own. Really more than a sphere of influence, because it extends beyond security concerns. It goes right into the really, what again should be just sovereign decisions of a nation. Which country am I going to trade with? Where am I going to buy my my soybeans or whatever? This is our own business, and we don't have to comply with U.S., the U.S. dictates. We are a sovereign nation. But that is thrown out the window. This is beyond the sphere of influence. We are going to dominate Latin America. That's what that document said. And then meanwhile, there was again a recognition that China is a great power, and even there's some certain kind of realism in there, a recognition that maybe we really can't win a war against China over there. But it also spelled out how we need to contain them and how we need to prevent them from expanding, how we need to prevent them from taking Taiwan, which is, of course, what we had recognized as being their own territory, because that would give them more influence in the region, allow them to have a sphere of influence. So anyway, there's a sphere of influence, and really beyond a sphere of influence for me, but not for thee. This is just where you see it. This is the kind of inconsistency that we see all the time in this Trump administration.
Okay, well, with this new Trump corollary, this Monroe Doctrine 2.0, then you're saying that how do we do the enforcement? How do we convince countries or strong arm them in saying you have to buy our stuff, have our investments, whatever it is? What we're seeing right now with Venezuela, that's the litmus test, right? This is our coercion method. Like, if you don't listen and do what we say, this is it. So if Venezuela, if it survives this, then it just shows that this whole Monroe Doctrine 2.0 is just there's nothing to enforce it. The U.S. doesn't have the means to do it. So this is a big test in that sense. If Trump succeeds, then it might be like, okay, there might be something to this Trump corollary. What does corollary even mean, by the way? We've been
Yeah, well, a corollary is just kind of a following an argument, an extension of the previous, position or argument that was made.
okay.
So
Like
it's just kind of an add-on. That's all that you really need to know in this case. Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point you make. This could be a real test case, and the Latin American countries should look at it this way. With the exception of Colombia, I'm sure there may be some other countries that have stepped forward. Of course, Cuba, but Colombia has been very, loud in its denunciations of what the U.S. is doing, right? But a lot of countries have been silent, and I find that troubling. It's just like, okay, you don't like Maduro, I understand that. You don't have to, you don't like his style of government, but don't you understand? It's like he falls and then it's going to be another one of you. And then you need to stand together. That would be my thinking. It's just that if you can show the U.S. that, hey, no, you just stated that you are the master of this hemisphere and that we need to bow down to you. You're not going to do that. You're going to try it in Venezuela. I don't like the Venezuelan government, but we need to demonstrate to you that you cannot do this. And I guess I'm absurdly idealistic, but I would just think that these other countries should be, go beyond rhetoric and provide real support and just let it be known that, hey, if you pick a fight with them, you're picking a fight with all of us.
Right. I mean, especially someone like Lula, right? He's part of BRICS, and Trump was trying to slap terrorists on him just because of Bolsonaro, right? I mean, he's getting very personal with this. So Brazil doesn't have a warm, fuzzy relationship with the United States.
Right.
Have they not voiced any support? Just a little bit, or
they may have, but it's nothing that. I think in general, the relations between Brazil and Venezuela are not good. And I think in general, Lula has been silent. He may have said something, but nothing. He hasn't stepped out the way that the Colombian president has.
But Russia hasn't been silent, and I don't think China has been that silent. I don't think they've done much, but I know Russia has been voicing support, right?
Yeah, I think just yesterday
and doing
they made
more
a very,
than voicing. They have equipment as well, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I think yesterday they made actually a very strongly worded denunciation of what the U.S. was doing there.
Right.
Yeah.
It feels like there are 10 people holding the steering wheel right now, and they're all pulling in different directions, trying to pilot this dying hegemon. Because I heard there was something that was not published in the public national security strategy paper, but something that was in a draft before, and I've seen it around on X. I saw it on an RT News article, this concept of the Core Five, that the U.S. was expressing this interest to plan a 5-nation club. Forget the G7, the G20, and this consists of U.S., Russia, India, China, and Japan. Have you heard of this?
I've heard of this. That's all I can say about it. I've just heard of it.
Yeah, I was just thinking. I mean, this makes sense to some. I mean, it makes sense to have a core with the big players, But then you also have this mix. What does that mean if you have this idea of the Core Five, but you are at war or with a proxy war with one? You're in economic war with China, and then you're trying to pit Japan against China and trying to pit India against China and Iran and Russia. It's just like. Can that even work? I mean, I like the idea. I like the idea, but it's just like...
Yeah, I think actually now I recall there was something about it that, okay, there would be this Core Five, but the president of this little club would be the U.S. The U.S. would have some special status. They would be able to call the meetings and, that kind of thing. So I don't think...
So they're not going to sign up.
No,
yeah, they're not going to sign up. Yeah. Japan might, but that's about it.
Right.
Okay, so is something going to happen in Venezuela?
I think so, but we've been saying that for 2 months now?
Do you think that if it does happen, do you think that South America will kind of rally around? Like we're saying right now, only Colombia seems to be giving some support, but once this actually happens, do you think there will be this huge, South American, uprising essentially?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I don't know Latin American society well enough. There clearly are some very strong pro-U.S. elements scattered throughout Latin America. And that's one reason why we see a lot of these countries kind of switch back and forth. It seems to be a divided continent in that way. We've seen it in Brazil, right? We had Bolsonaro. Actually, Bolsonaro, when it came to like geopolitics, wasn't quite so firmly in the U.S. camp, but he did tend to lean that way. He didn't withdraw from BRICS. Okay, so actually Brazil is kind of has been leaning towards BRICS for a while, even to some extent under Bolsonaro. But a lot of other countries, Argentina is an obvious one, Bolivia is another one, have flip-flopped. It's just like with one election, they'll actually completely reorient their geopolitics. So we saw that recently. I think it was Bolivia that just signed up for the Isaac Accords, that they restored relations with Israel because the left-leaning president was lost an election, and the new forces that came in. There are a lot of, again, I don't know if it's so much population as power, but there is if you look at the way power is distributed across Latin America, a lot of it does actually lean towards the U.S. for various reasons. So it's not like the U.S. is going to be entirely united in condemning the U.S. There are people like, the lovely Machado, the Nobel laureate, who are very strongly pro-U.S., even within Venezuela. I'm sure that's a small minority in that country, but they do exist and they do have power.
Okay, well, I imagine just the actions that we're doing, though, just like we've said before, just the soft power, those, you said South America was a divided continent. The divide is shifting. It's not as divided, I think. I think there's just enough bad will, ill will out there for the United States. That
I don't think this is going to help them. Right. There are, again, like I said, they have their cheering section, and those people will cheer for them, the Machados of Latin America. But I don't think overall it just can't help them. It's ugly. It's a reminder of the old U.S. imperialism. Mm-hmm. And it's being carried out, again, by a country that has lost a lot of its sheen. Again, for the various reasons that we discussed.
Yeah. No, Gaza has just destroyed the United States' reputation. I don't think people realize how damaging this has been to the United States, just around the world. I mean, if we feel disgust, imagine just how the rest of the world feels. It's awful. Okay, well, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Nick Fuentes, because he had that Piers Morgan interview, and he's just blowing up. And this is somebody that's closer to my age group, and I just find it a fascinating phenomenon. I didn't really know much about Nick Fuentes at all until just this year. So just first, you can just tell me, just what are your thoughts? What did you think of the interview?
Yeah, okay. I didn't watch the whole interview, but I watched most of it. And so I think I have a good sense of what it was all about. I guess first of all, I'll say that I thought the interview was conducted fairly. It wasn't a series of ambushes. Again, what Piers Morgan did was that he took clips and then, asked Nick from previous videos by Nick Fuentes, and then asked Nick Fuentes to defend what he said or explain it. And I thought that was fair. I'll say that. And I think sometimes Nick Fuentes did a very good job of explaining himself, and other times he didn't. I guess all in all, maybe it kind of surprised me, but I kind of felt divided, about this interview. Sometimes I did find myself agreeing with Piers Morgan, and sometimes I found myself agreeing with Nick Fuentes. And then sometimes I felt like neither of them was really explaining his respective position very well. Maybe just to get into the substance, I guess all in all, I kind of understand. I understand where Nick Fuentes is coming from. And I can see why, he is popular, with the younger generation, especially with younger men. I can understand that. There are a lot of things, like I remember growing up with these things. Just to, give you an example is, there's the questions of race, Um, and he just didn't seem to be care. Sometimes he seemed to care. Sometimes, well, he didn't like him applying it to his father. And I think that's a separate issue. He wanted to keep his father out of it, and I could understand, but he didn't mind when it was applied to himself. And I can see where that's coming from, because I remember, especially back in my generation, it was just like, essentially the way things were set up was that every racial group could take pride in itself. And, to some extent, you know, you know, yeah, and that could take various forms. In some cases, like it was just if you were a black, you didn't want your own people marrying outside of the group, and that was also true of Asians and whatever. And they could speak about it openly. And I would hear these kind of things growing up, and then expressions of various expressions of pride in one's own people. But heaven forbid that if you're a white person and you express pride in your own people, or even like in just your general European heritage, that was obviously you were a Nazi. That seemed to be the reaction. Of course, I grew up in a very extreme environment in Berkeley, and over time it became tiring. It really did. You began to see this as a great double standard. When whites were a very large majority in the country, when they were 80% of the population, it really wasn't an issue. But over time, they have ceased to be that. And now already with the younger generation, they are not a majority. I think the younger generation is already just a plurality. And then overall, I think the forecast is that in 2042, that whites will cease to be a majority. So this double standard is just not going to hold. And it's something that, again, the liberal establishment holds on to very dearly. It's sort of like just part of, again, of their identity. It's like you're supposed to shriek anytime somebody talks about white pride or something like that, and immediately say that this is, on the road to Auschwitz or something, just some very extreme reactions. This is like an expression of pure evil for them. And I'm sure these younger people, they are, many of them are minorities within their own school. They get it. Sometimes they're not treated well by the other groups. And when they try to band together, like all the other groups do, they're told that they're Nazis. And then they've had it. And so I think that's what you see in Nick Fuentes. And so sometimes you see rather extreme rhetoric, but it's a response to that. I think, again, this double standard was never going to hold. And we can see that it's starting to break down in the younger generation. And Nick Fuentes is giving expression to that. So that's one thing. Again, it's dangerous. I don't want to live in a world where we have angry, racial and ethnic groups, where we're hurling insults at each other. There's a problem when we have excess sensitivity. One thing I've noticed, like even way back when I was, in my Berkeley days, this was about the time you were born. I worked at the Oakland International Airport for UPS, and it was very much like you find in that part of California. It was very mixed racially, and so there were quite a few black workers, white workers, Hispanic, and in general people got along. And I noticed like the one white guy that got along best with the black guys was the one who told the racist jokes. Mm-hmm. And they thought he was really funny. And I think they sensed this, that he was genuine. He wasn't, my father was a civil rights lawyer, and I just couldn't ever do that. But that actually kind of created a distance, because when you're with real friends, you can poke fun at each other. And so there is this excess sensitivity. This cult of sensitivity actually can create barriers between races and ethnic groups. Of course, I think there are certain lines that you shouldn't cross, and we need to be respectful, in a broader sense. But among, like young men who are actually, working shoulder to shoulder, if they never told kind of jokes about each other, you would know there's something wrong. Right. And so, for sure. That's, so I think, again, like Nick Fuentes said, oh yeah, I got black friends. And Piers Morgan seemed to be utterly shocked, befuddled, like this could happen. But I say, yeah, I'm sure he does. And they don't care. And they tell jokes, about white people to him, and he laughs. And that's what happens. I think that's something they understand. It's just like, people like Piers Morgan, and I'll say that he's probably very well intentioned, but he probably doesn't really have much experience with people like black working class people. And, he's very much concerned about them, but he doesn't relate to them in a real, meaningful way, the way that that coworker of mine at the Oakland airport did. So, that's one thing I just wanted to mention. And then there's the whole Jewish question. And I can, Piers Morgan, pointed out, he told this kind of joked about the Holocaust and said that Hitler was cool. And Piers Morgan, had a little clip from a friend of his, a Jewish friend who's, I guess, his parents were survivors of Auschwitz, and I thought that was fair, actually. I don't think you should tell jokes like that. I'll be honest. I don't think that's right. I mean, that the experience of, we should condemn and honor other people's ancestors and understand and empathize with their suffering. I think that's important. But the problem is, and I believe Nick Fuentes, I know he did. He explained it. The problem is, it's the way that this whole thing, these atrocities alone have been essentially weaponized, right? They've been, and more than that, they've kind of been made into this religion that you can't utter any sort of blasphemy again. And that's not true of anybody else's suffering. And it's been used, again, as we see, for all kinds of current day suffering, to inflict current day suffering, to expand Zionist Israel, to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, and even up to and including genocide. It's been put in the service of that. And so, again, people like in his generation have grown up and they're always told, whenever they ask questions like Nick Fuentes did, it's like, why is it that, we give Israel all the support? I thought that, we were America first and we give them billions of dollars every year. Why do we do that? And he didn't get an honest answer. Nobody could. And then because he kept on asking the question, he was attacked. And so anyway, they're looking and say, like, there's something wrong here. There's, again, another double standard. I'm not allowed to ask these questions. So, and I'm just told basically to shut up and support the Zionists. And they say, this is wrong. And so it leads to, okay, yeah, we're told to be so solemn and so respectful and to put this above all, to the point that we refuse to even look at current day genocides. So, well, forget it. I'm just going to tell nasty jokes or stupid jokes about them. I'm just going to be irreverent. And so I can understand where that's coming from. I think it's a mistake to do that kind of thing, but I can understand where it's coming from. Again, you don't have to go to Nick Fuentes. You can go to Norman Finkelstein, for very, very thoroughly researched expose on what he calls the Holocaust industry, how it's been used, again, for really nefarious ends.
Yeah. Is it really true that you can be jailed in something like 17 countries in Europe for just questioning the Holocaust?
I believe that's true. I don't know the exact number, but I believe that's true. There are very strict Holocaust laws in different countries.
Won't that make people question the Holocaust?
Yeah.
That's
right. Including Russia, actually. I don't know how. So there are some laws on, the books in Russia that just don't get enforced. I don't know if it's really been enforced, but in places like Germany, they're enforced very, very, strictly. It's just, you have to be very, very careful about what you say. And yeah. France, it's not just there. And then, as he pointed out, it's not true in the UK, but there are these huge social consequences. Just, again, for sometimes just asking honest questions. It doesn't mean to, that you ask an honest question and you really insist on a good answer. There's nothing malicious about that, but that can get you into real trouble in all kinds of countries, including our own.
That's crazy. Yeah, you mentioned Finkelstein or Finkelstein. I just feel like we have the whole range for anti-Zionist content. Like you have the Fuentes to Finkelstein, which is very academic, to somebody that's more emotional. I think it just shows you just the the core feeling within so many people in the United States that are not happy with the narratives that are being told, not happy with these double standards. And there's something that people are saying that is just resonating, because I think just the most fascinating thing for me about Nick Fuentes is that how heavily canceled he was, relegated, can use PayPal, relegated to Rumble. And despite that, he is just blowing up everywhere. And it's such a fascinating phenomenon. It's like you lost. Your problem was holding these double standards. It just cannot hold up to scrutiny. And now that we're seeing it, it's over. Someone like Barry Weiss, for example, that took over CBS News, hundreds of millions of dollars behind her. She's pushing out content on YouTube, and it's like getting the same amount of views as like our videos. It just shows that that where the future is going. But what does this mean for the future generation, do you think, where we're moving? Like it's just happening so rapidly, this sea change in narratives, these things that we weren't supposed to talk about or question, all of a sudden are being questioned and talked about. And
right. Yeah, well, I think it's inevitable. I mean, Nick Fuentes is just part of it. He's one particular expression of it. But there is, in the younger generation, again, like I grew up in the shadow of World War II, and so everything was defined by, I think it's fair to say, a particular interpretation of World War II, which included the Holocaust. So everybody's outlook was just defined by that. But World War II is now 80 years in the past, and a lot of things have happened since then, particularly in Israel, in Gaza. And so you have this generation that didn't grow up that. They're growing up in the shadow of the Gaza genocide. And you're telling them, okay, so, the old tactic of screaming anti-Semite, every time they ask a question that makes, the Zionists uncomfortable, that's not working anymore. It inevitably was not going to work. I think, it couldn't hold forever. It held for a long time. There's this huge Holocaust industry, as, Finkelstein has pointed out and argued very, very persuasively. And it's amazing, actually, that it's been so effective for so long, but it was never going to last forever. And then it's just like the recklessness of the Zionists themselves, really, more than anything else, is undoing it. And I think that's the inevitable trend, is coming apart, and there's no putting it together again. And then on the questions of race, that's I don't know, it's always there's always a potential for racial and interracial and interethnic conflict everywhere in the world. It's an unfortunate reality of the human experience, and it can be a challenge, for different groups to coexist peaceably. There are success stories. I would say by and large, we do have a success story in Russia. There are a lot of different ethnic groups. And in general, they are doing well. There's always the potential that there will be strife. There was a horrible, Chechen war not too long in the past. So there's always the potential for violence, unfortunately. But now, we don't see that. So again, it's like some of the strongest supporters of the government are actually these different ethnic groups.
Right. But something that's, in Russia or in China, you have a strong core majority, and like you said, now for our generation here in the United States, we're moving into, or the younger generation, it's already a plurality. There is no majority anymore. Have we had a country like that, and has it succeeded? We are truly a melting pot. I mean, America is supposed to be this great experiment. I think we can all get along. I get along with that. I mean, maybe I'm multiracial, so for me, it's like I had no concept really of race most of my time growing up. It's almost forced upon you. You're almost forced to try to think racially, because there's all this talk about race, and you're just presented with it all the time. And it's like, we're not born racist. I never looked at people that way, but it's almost like now, because of these double standards, people are starting to segment into tribes.
Yeah, no, there's always a danger of it. We've seen it happen in different places like Yugoslavia. Again, that was a multi-ethnic nation, and it existed peacefully for many years. And then following the collapse of the Soviet Union, it it began to experience a breakup that turned very, very violent, unfortunately. And I remember, reading accounts to say, like, we had our neighbors were Bosnians on one side and there were Croatians on the other side. Nobody thought about it. We're all Yugoslavians. We all got along. It was just not a big deal. And then there was one day that all of a sudden it became a big deal. So there's that potential. And it seems to happen again when the center ceases to hold. There was this unifying central power under Tito, who was essentially the dictator of Yugoslavia, but when that collapsed, that central power dissolved. There was this growing chaos, and then all of a sudden these ethnic identities, because people don't, they're looking away to identifying with, again, the center, and the center is gone. Then what do they identify with? Oh yeah, I'm Croatian, or I'm Bosnian, and then unfortunately we had some really violent civil wars. Now it happened in Ukraine too. This is what I've heard too from people from Ukraine, is that there was a time not too long ago. Again, it really up until the coup of 2014. That in Russian-speaking communities, like within the U.S., a lot of those people came from Ukraine. There were Russian speakers, and then a lot of them, but Russia was their favorite language, and many of them came from Russia, and they all got along, and nobody thought, oh, you're Ukrainian, I'm Russian. And then all of a sudden, this one person was telling me that he began to have this very uncomfortable experience. So these people that he had been dealt with for decades, he considered friends, all of a sudden refused to speak Russian to him and insisted on Ukrainian. And, and we say, what's going on? So these things can break down. They can, when the center breaks down, then interethnic and interracial conflict, unfortunately, becomes much more likely.
What's so different, though, about the United States is that we have such a diverse group of people. When you're talking about the Bosnians and the Croats, I mean, for most of us in the West, we're like, oh, they're all Slavs, right? They sound the same to me. The same thing with Ukraine and Russia, right? The similar language, a lot of them do speak Russian or identify as Russian. So you have this mix. So usually when there's these conflicts, it's actually ironically when the people are very similar. And then I think it allows for you to try to find a difference more in ideology. But the thing is, if you have in the United States where you have Asians and blacks and Indians, whites, it's all mixed. If you start to divide it, you can't make it on the ideology because the ideology is so obviously racist. It's so clear. It's not that, oh, we are some kind of different people. It's like, yeah, we know we're different, and you're just killing them and you hate them because they're this. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like a protective covering, potentially, I'm thinking.
Potentially, yeah. I don't know. It's just like, that doesn't really reassure me. You may be right. Who knows how it's going to play out. But there is a potential, we're saying these kind of arguments that we wouldn't entertain today, they may, unfortunately, be adopted by the next generation.
Right.
They may not mind being openly, truly racist. Not in the sort of like the somewhat, let's say, what am I saying about Nick Fuentes? It's sort of an act, It's sort of clearly he doesn't actually hate black people or whatever, But that may cease to be an act at some point in a future generation. It just could happen.
Yeah, I guess there's no precedent for the United States because it's all so new. So many of the people here are also just, we don't have very deep roots, so it doesn't cause that. It makes
something, maybe that some sort of common American identity will hold. I think there's some truth to that. Perhaps the roots were deeper in places like Eastern Europe, and that perhaps explains these interethnic conflicts. But I don't know. There's just, these things are hard to explain. They're really beyond the scope of rationality, and people may seize on these. They may be very surface realities and very shallow realities, but they may seize on them, and we may have some very serious conflict. I'm not going to make any predictions, but I think it's something to to be aware of, the possibility that this might happen.
Right. I hope just with the race stuff that it doesn't get out of control and we can just all get along and stop looking at things so tribally. But we don't know. But the thing is I think just the phenomena of Nick Fuentes is that he's bringing these things up for debate. Especially when we talk about Israel, I think that's a lot easier for people to get behind. And once you bring that up for debate, you can't really bottle it up again. And I think that's what we're seeing. And that's why this is such a seismic moment right now for us, is that these conversations, like our relationship with Israel, and for some, I think to a lesser extent, the race conversation is being brought to the forefront. And there is no good answer that the Zionists have against it. And so that's why I'm just reassured. And when I see that phenomenon, I have mixed feelings with it when I see it. But I'm seeing this part of it, the narrative, this tidal wave. You try to just hold back this lie for so long, and now it's just all crumbling down, and everybody's talking about it, and everybody's angry. And that's why I think it's just such a different phenomenon, because there's so many people that have just like a position like, I don't like this, and I support this, but they don't really care. But people here are just actually angry. So I think and I think it's a majority of people now, and even if it was a minority of people, the fact that they're so animated about this issue with Israel, it's, Tucker Carlson's also just been going scorched earth on it. Just some real damning episodes, interviews, just talking about how the Gaza genocide and how we support it and how we can't be supporting Israel in this. And so it's I don't know if I have a question. It makes me excited when I see that stuff happening.
Right. Well, it does. In a way, I'm encouraged by it. I tell you, I don't like gas chamber jokes or whatever. I don't like them. But I understand where in part they're coming from. It's just, really where they are coming from. It's just this false religion that we've had for such a long time. You can't blaspheme against this, and it was used to do all kinds of terrible things. Now these people are purposely blaspheming, and it makes me uncomfortable. But it's, if you want to point the finger and say, like, who's responsible for that? It's those people that insisted on this false religion and persecuting anybody that questioned any aspect of it for such a long time. This is what you were going to get, and now you're getting it. And I see very little awareness of that. Again, I've read a number of articles about Nick Fuentes and other people, and it's just, for so many Jews, it's just, irrational anti-Semitism. That's it. It's just some sort of pathology that Gentiles get from time to time. And we just need to scream at them and tell them that they're sick and to stop this. And there's no, you can criticize. I think they would be right to criticize Nick Fuentes and say, this is wrong. This is not funny. You shouldn't do this. My grandfather or whatever. I think that would be very fair if they did that. But they also have to stop and say, where does Nick Fuentes come from? It was Ben Shapiro and, Barry Weiss and these people that just tried to, even when he was a nobody, he was like 18 years old, tried to destroy him. And then he says, hey, wait, what's going on? You say, maybe this was some behavior, that on your side that actually contributed to this, more than contributed to this, really created this. There needs to be that awareness if you're going to get out of this. Now, again, I see this again and again in these articles, like in Haaretz. But then there are people like Max Blumenthal. He's one of the best. He's completely open. He understands. That he understands where the Nick Fuentes comes from. He's not going to support him. I'm sure he's going to be critical of a lot of things that he says. But he understands where he's coming from. He says, look, it's this really, we got to stop this bad behavior. As a group, we got to stop. We have to. Now, unfortunately, this is when people think about Judaism, they think about Netanyahu and they think about the genocide. And he says, I'm a Jew and I don't want that, But can you blame people for thinking that? Because those people actually do have the upper hand within the Jewish community, and they are making those associations. They're insisting on them.
Yeah, no, it's true. When I I see a Star of David now, it conjures up something different. It doesn't, it didn't used to do that for me, when I see these Jewish symbols, and it's just such a shame. And I know I have to guard myself against it and just be like, separate Zionism from Judaism. But like you said, they make that make that association with Israel and Judaism. They're forcing that association, and so it's just like it's scary, and it's just so getting out of control. I feel like with Israel, and any idea of them trying to be a moral country is just gone. I don't understand how people can be behind it anymore. You saw like Ben Gvir and other members of the cabinet. They're, instead of wearing the "bring the hostages home now," according to them, it was supposed to be once this could all end as soon as the hostages are back. Okay, well, clearly that didn't happen. And now they replaced that pin with a noose pin. It's a noose. Right. Did you see that?
Yeah, right.
Did you say that we want to...
Instead of a yellow ribbon, there's a little noose. Right.
Whoa. Yeah. It's like, that's worse than like having a skull cap, a skull and crossbones flag. It's like, you're just saying you're the bad guy. And that's to kill the Palestinian hostages. They're not prisoners, right? I mean, these are people that are just being taken.
So many of them are, right?
Right. The vast majority with no trial or anything, saying just so you can take them and just kill them. That's insane.
Right. Yeah. It's about a particular law. It's supposed to be an anti-terrorism law that will allow capital punishment, which is currently not allowed in Israel, but it will allow it for non-Jewish terrorists, people convicted of terrorism who are not Jewish. So it is, it makes this racial distinction, you can say, there's or ethnic distinction, however you want to define it. And that on the face of it should just earn universal condemnation. But again, Israel's friends are basically covering it up,
And so, but the whole world is screaming, and it's just, we need change. And I feel like it has to come. There's so much pressure. There's so much global pressure on this now. I mean, we just see every day, I'm seeing just these horrible footage, just these children. I just saw a little girl that died of hypothermia in the tent, just like, it's madness, and it's like, well, we just okay, well, take a look at that on my phone,
the horror continues. Again, we don't talk about it as much, but the horror continues, right? It's just, there's no question about it. And Hamas returned all the hostages. I think there maybe is like one dead hostage, one corpse that they still haven't located, one or two. That's it. They fulfilled their side of the bargain there, and the Israelis haven't. They continue to kill. They continue to deny humanitarian aid. They continue to deny food. Starvation is again becoming a problem. It never really went away. It became very serious, and they were just right on the verge of mass death. We're into the hundreds of starvation deaths, and then there was some relief. People are getting a meal a day, so they survive, but they're always hungry. Just think of the misery. And that's continued. And now I think because winter has come, the hospitals, the ones that remain, have seen a real spike in infants with acute malnutrition. It just never ends for them.
Yeah, it's so inhumane. I mean, we fixate on the number of dead, but I just seen so many videos and pictures of kids without arms, hands, legs.
There's so many.
And like you just said, the malnutrition. It's just like, if you have any heart, especially if you've had kids and you just you see these pictures, and I also, just the idea of the malnutrition for me is just so horrible. Because it's like, my boys want to eat all the time, and they're not eating. They're screaming and they're upset. Just like that pain of having to hear that, and just you can't feed them, and then just people. It's such hell, and it's
Just stop and put yourself in your shoes just for a few seconds, and you just think, oh my God. It makes when we think about our problems, they're nothing. What the nightmare that they're living in. And just, we get the statistics, 70,000 dead. That's, the official, actually counted by medical authorities in Gaza. But we all know that, and that's just direct kills, people that have been killed as a result of bombs and bullets. Again, that's very important to remember that. That's not the total number of deaths that resulting from the violence inflicted on them. Because in every war, we found this, this holds true over the course of many, many decades. The majority of deaths are not actually direct deaths, they're indirect deaths. It's because people don't have access to healthcare. It's because people don't have access to clean drinking water, because they don't have shelter. And you think of Gaza, it's just like, the Israelis deliberately went after all of that infrastructure that makes life possible within Gaza. So there's no question about it that there are many more people that have died and will die indirectly, from this violence that was unleashed against them. The ratio, again, it's just what researchers have found is usually anywhere from 3 to 15 times the number of direct deaths. So the direct deaths are probably around 100,000. Again, we have the actual counted deaths, but there's going to be more because it was hard often to report deaths because so many of the hospitals were destroyed. So many of the morgues ceased to exist, and then there are bodies under the rubble, etc. It's probably closer to 100,000. So when you're talking about 3 to 15, the lower figure would be 300,000. Of indirect deaths.
Yeah, and it's just so crazy because when you see it, it's not like this was a natural disaster and that these poor people are suffering. No, this is, and then when you learn about it, just like, my God, we're doing this to these people, and you see these kids like, somebody help them. Like, oh no, we're not allowed. You can't help them. You just gotta watch this.
Right. Like with the humanitarian aid, there recently, the Israelis have, for example, I don't know if they lifted this restriction, but for a while anyway, they were not allowing any baby bottles into Gaza, and no syringes, because they said, well, these are dual use. Hamas could use these to make something, so we're not going to let baby bottles in. That's the kind of thing. It's deliberate sadism. They're trying to make their lives miserable. They want to drive them out, and it's important to understand too that this didn't all start on October 7th or on October 8th. This is something I remember reading about this decades ago. They were just like, for a while, they would say, no more toys. Why? Why do you do things like that? What kind of person does that? But they would deny, any kinds of shipments of toys into Gaza, or no pasta, or, that kind of thing. And they'd laugh, we're putting them on a diet. Ha, ha, ha. This is, these people are real sadists.
Well, I always ask this, but they won't get away with it, right? They aren't getting away. They seem to be getting away with it, but the fact that we are all waking up to it means that in the long run, they won't get away with it. It's just such a painful process. And
yeah. Well, yeah. No, I think we know the answer. It's just in the short run where they are getting away with it, but the writing is on the wall. Israel really was looking pretty again before October 7th, and it's not now. It's just, I think most people would wager on, let's say, Israel being here 50 years from now. If you made that wager on October 6th, I think, the odds would be strongly in favor of them being here 50 years from now, Israel existing as a Zionist entity. Let's just put it that way. But after now, I think the odds would go way down.
This war with Iran, a lot of people just said that 100% it's just on pause, but it's going to resume. But I think now as time's gone on, a lot of people are thinking maybe it's not going to happen. How do you feel? Do you think that it's...
Well, right. Again, I noticed within the dissident community, there was just everybody saying, it's going to happen definitely by the end of the year. We're getting very close to the end of the year. It might still happen. But I just don't see any evidence for that, which doesn't mean that it can't happen, that something isn't being worked out in secret. But it would just be unlike anything that we've seen before. There's, for the longest time, there was all this very steady drumbeat, really a preparation for a war. And we're just not seeing that. You occasionally get a statement here or there, but we're not getting that from Netanyahu and his government, and we're definitely not getting that from Trump. Trump is still insisting that this was the greatest thing that has ever been done, and he obliterated, the nuclear program, and there's just no need for war. And that was even in that strategy paper. So if we see like a real effort to get the Americans, back on board, and if we see Trump coming up with some sort of new spin on things, at that point I'd say, yeah, maybe there's a war in the works, but I just don't see it now. And again, there are real problems. Iran can fight back, as they showed before. So Israel is just not that eager to go to war with Iran. They had that Operation Rising Lion. They had spent years, and I think in some cases decades, preparing for it. They had laid the groundwork for it. They had their agents, they had, all their secret houses. They had the drones hidden away in different parts of Iran. And they sprang that trap, and, the hope was to bring about regime change, but they failed. And I don't think they have another trick up their sleeve. I might be wrong, and they do, and they'll attack tomorrow. I can't say that can't happen, but it seems unlikely. I think that was the big trick they had up their sleeves, and they're probably working on something else, but it may take years again.
If support for Israel just continues to decline, and there is this slow decoupling process, because let's be honest, that's how it's likely going to go. I'm often waiting for just some seismic event to change it, but it just there will be this general trend where fewer and fewer politicians that take money from AIPAC or express Zionist views will be elected into positions of power, and then we will slowly start to see. I know there's going to be a lot of battling, but we'll slowly start to see us starting to remove the support from Israel. As it collapses, first of all, will that just make Israel collapse? And if it does start to collapse, what does that do here to America? Will we be able to do this process gradually and peacefully, this sort of decoupling? And then can Israel exist in any capacity without all this backing from the West? If it went back to the 67 lines or whatever, where could this potentially go?
Yeah, well, it seems to me it's going to take a long time to undo the damage. I can't say that a peaceful resolution is impossible, but it's going to take a long time because of what has happened in Israel, what has happened in Gaza and the West Bank, and what has happened within Israeli society. That's not going to change overnight. Those settlers in the West Bank are not going to just come back home, happily. No, they're actively engaged in ethnic cleansing right now with the support of the IDF. That's what's happening now. And could you think of an Israel where those forces are no longer in charge? Yeah, but I don't, but that's only some sort of like some distant dream. I can imagine that. But right now, you don't see it. There'd have to be an actual rejection of Zionism, and that's just not there. There are a few. If you actually looking for people that reject Zionism, who are willing to, I think you have to go to almost single figures within Israel.
Yeah,
it is a Zionist country, and the logic of Zionism is one of expansion. It's a logic of ethnic supremacism. Even among those people who maybe are not so comfortable with that idea, and so tend to downplay it when they talk about it. But as a Zionist, they're actually committed to it. I think that's the logic. That's the truth.
So you think that this will eventually end then with just sort of a complete collapse of Israel, complete defeat of Israel, and there will be sort of this, diaspora again of Jews that just flee to Europe and the West?
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's that possibility, but then there's also the Samson option. That's the scary thing. So that's why I'm afraid of a sudden collapse, is because a sudden collapse, and Israel that exists today, if it was faced with, with a true threat to its existence, it looks like it was on the verge of, let's say, it was about to lose a war and be conquered by the enemy, I think they would exercise the Samson option. They would go nuclear. I'm afraid that's, I'm actually fairly confident that they would. Or let's just say it's a very high likelihood. It's just so high a likelihood that I just don't want to go there. So that's why I hope for peaceful evolution, but that it also seems like a rather absurd hope at the present time. But maybe if, the anti-Zionist forces within this country become ascendant, and we actually, begin to reduce our support of Israel, and we make it clear to Israel that they cannot continue on the current course, we could perhaps strengthen forces within Israel. We do the opposite of what we've been doing for the last several decades. We actually support those forces that want to reach some kind of peace with their neighbors, and are willing to withdraw to those 1967 borders. Again, it's just such a small group right now. That really just seems like an absurd dream, unfortunately. I mean, just pure wishful thinking. That's so, unfortunately. And then also on the other side, is that I would like to see anti-Zionism, become ascendant in this country, but I'd like to see a rational one. It's just that people are not very rational. They tend to swing, from one extreme to another. And, that's why the things like the gas oven jokes or whatever that Fuentes, it kind of bothers me. It can lead to a coarsening and then actually a real violent anti-Semitism. And the Israelis confronted with that are going to just circle their wagons even more. And maybe it would be even more likely to, engage in some kind of real nihilistic action, the launching nuclear tipped missiles.
Yeah, well, the Israelis love anti-Semitism. It just gives them meaning and purpose and justification for everything.
Unfortunately, the great majority, it seems to be true.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's the most fascinating question, is how this conflict could end. And it just, we have this
I just don't see.
I
try to hope for a good ending. I really do, but I just don't see it. I know other people like Jeffrey Sachs seems more hopeful. Are we going to go to the two-state solution? I just don't see how that's going to happen in Israel, in today's Israel. And, or any Israel in the next couple of decades. It's hard to imagine it happening.
Well, I mean, if you just enforced it, right? We sent our military there and say, get the heck out and go back to your, behind your line.
Yeah. Well, maybe. Maybe it's just that these people that are in charge, they are just so deranged, and they really, I think they really could go nuclear. That they have the nuclear option, and they have their very, very powerful allies within this country. So, it just makes me, who knows, it could be the Samson option in Israel or a coup in the United States or whatever. I don't have any idea, but this is a very powerful. This is a monster that we've helped to create, let's be honest. And it's not going to die easily, it's not going to die in its sleep. I don't think so.
Is there anything that can be done to, save the world from the Samson option? Could we have some super commando team that knows where the location is come in and just all right, we secured the location, these aren't launching? That's almost what I feel like needs to happen.
Right. Well, who knows, maybe.
Yeah.
By the way, it's
one
just
hell of a movie.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah.
We'll go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh, yeah. Anyway, I was just going to mention that, Israel did go nuclear in the early 1960s, and it was something that the U.S. opposed as a matter of policy. They did not want to see nuclear proliferation to Israel. But there is a lot of evidence that the head of counter intelligence at that time, who was, why did I say his name? Was it a G? Anyway, he was a rabid Zionist. He himself was not Jewish. He was, I think, Catholic, but he was a rabid Zionist. He was a very, very extreme supporter of Zionism. And he essentially knew what was going on, that they were transferring this technology and these materials to Israel. And he was, it would have been it really was his responsibility to prevent it as his head of counterintelligence, but he in fact facilitated it, he did in fact facilitate it. That's what the Israelis at the time actually report.
These traitors, and look at the pickle the world is in now, thanks to it.
Yeah.
And then, and then they killed JFK too, right?
Yeah, well, that's actually connected to that whole story, but let's not go down that rabbit hole.
Okay, we won't go down. We can leave it for something else.
Yeah.
Okay, Dad, I think we can end it there then.
Okay.
Okay, have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.